I still remember the smell before I remember the faces. It was the smell of broth simmering from dawn, of roasted fowl brushed with honey, of loaves rising in the oven while the sky outside the kitchen windows was still only a pale line of grey. The day the princess was born, the whole palace breathed that kind of air, thick with steam and expectation. We had been told for weeks that no mistake would be forgiven. A child had finally come to the royal house, and every plate, every ribbon, every word would be weighed like gold dust. I was younger then, though already called the head cook, with a scar on my thumb from years of careless chopping, and a mind trained to remember recipes better than people. I had been up all night with my assistants, checking that the sugar did not burn, that the meat was seasoned just enough, that the wine from the southern vineyards was not corked. From the courtyard we could hear the clatter of carpenters assembling tables in the great hall. Higher up, tailors and servants hurried through corridors, arms full of silk and velvet. By the time the bells rang to announce that the princess had come into the world, everyone in the kitchen already knew more than any proclamation would say. The queen had suffered, the king had paced like a caged lion, the midwives had whispered nervous prayers at others. When the child finally cried, one of the younger maids swore she heard relief more than triumph in that thin voice. We had barely the space of a deep breath before more orders arrived. There would be a christening, a feast the likes of which no one had seen in our kingdom for years. The king wanted the great hall dressed in gold. He wanted swans brought in from the royal lake, their feathers plucked and their meat stuffed with herbs. He wanted sugared fruits shaped like stars and moons, and pies with crusts so delicate they might fall apart at a sigh. Most of all, we were told, the king wished to honour the wise women of the realm, the fairies whose gifts would guide his daughter's life. It was the first time I heard the word used so openly. Fairies. Until then, they had been stories murmured over the last crumbs of bread when work was done. Tales of women who arrived uninvited, who liked respect more than jewels, who watched the world from the edges of forests and the corners of old rooms. As a man standing over boiling pots, I learned they walked on real feet and took up real space at a table. The chamberlain came down with a list in his hand and worry in his eyes. 12 golden plates, he said, 12 crystal goblets, 12 embroidered napkins, each one with a tiny crown stitched at the corner, 12 places of honour for the 12 fairies the king had summoned. 12, and not one more. Gold, after all, does not stretch. Someone asked very softly how many fairies there truly were. The chamberlain pressed his lips together, as if even the question tasted dangerous. 13, perhaps, maybe more. Who can count those who do not care to be counted? Then he shrugged in the careful way of men who serve kings. The king has ordered 12 plates, he said. We will lay 12 places. The rest is in the hands of those who like to meddle. In the kitchen, we are used to shortages. Not enough flour, not enough salt, not enough time. We adjust as we must. A little more water, a slower fire, a clever substitution. Up in the great hall, they seemed to believe that numbers on a list could bend reality itself. For every guest there must be a seat, and for every seat a name. If one name did not fit, then that name could surely be forgotten. I remember leaning on the edge of the door that opened from the warm, noisy kitchen into the polished silence of the hall. The servants were spreading cloths that shone like still water over the long tables. At the far end, on a raised platform, stood the high table, already set with the 12 plates of hammered gold. They glittered under the light from the tall windows, perfect and cold. For a moment, I felt as if each plate was an eye, watching, waiting, counting. Perhaps it seems a small thing to you, 1 plate more or less, 1 guest left off a list. In daily life, we often make such choices. We assume feelings will mend in time. In a palace and in a story, the small things grow teeth. The space left empty at a feast can open like a wound that never heals. That morning, I did not know how far the consequences would reach. I only knew that my staff was tired, the bread was nearly ready to come out of the ovens, and the great hall needed to be filled with smells strong enough to drown out the worries that seemed to hover like smoke around the nobles' heads. So I turned back to my stoves, gave orders, lifted pots, and stirred. Still, as I chopped herbs for the swans and tasted the sweetness of the sauce on the tip of my tongue, I kept seeing those 12 plates and the invisible 13th place that had not been set. There is always an invisible 13th place wherever people pretend the world is smaller than it is. We leave out the neighbour who lives too far away, the voice that speaks too softly, the person whose presence might unsettle the harmony we claim to protect. Many years later, when I think of that day, I do not first see the princess wrapped in silk or the proud king in his robe. I see a long table waiting, 1 seat missing, and a room full of people who believed they had arranged everything. And I ask myself, as I hope you will ask yourself, whether it is ever truly wise to build our celebrations on the assumption that those we have left outside the door will be content to remain there. But that question belongs to the hours that came after. On the morning of the christening, I was only a cook trying to keep the soup from boiling over, a man in a stained apron in the shadow of a story that was just beginning. By midday, the palace had become a great instrument, every corridor a string pulled tight, every door a drum waiting to sound. We in the kitchen were its beating heart, though no one in the hall would have put it that way. They said the feast was to honour the princess and the fairies, but I knew that a celebration lives or dies by its food as much as by its speeches. The soups must arrive hot, the wines cool, the pastries light enough to vanish on the tongue. Joy is easier to feel on a full stomach. From the yard outside, carts rolled in with fresh provisions that had travelled all night. Game birds, baskets of herbs, wheels of cheese, casks of wine. My assistants stumbled under the weight, sleeves rolled to their elbows, cheeks red from the heat. It is a strange thing about great occasions. For those at the top, they are remembered in flashes of music and silk, while for those below, they are remembered in the ache of the back and the cuts on the fingers. The chamberlain visited us again, this time with his anxiety wrapped in ceremony. He held a list so neatly written that it seemed a sin to smudge it with kitchen air. He read out the courses in a solemn tone as if he were reciting a prayer. First, a clear broth with tiny dumplings shaped like crowns. Then roasted swans on beds of fragrant leaves. Then pies filled with songbirds, their crusts decorated with pastry roses. After that, sugared fruits, candied orange peel, almond cakes, creams and custards, dishes whose sweetness would cling to the memory for days. Beneath all these, written in smaller script, were the notes about the fairies, 12 in number, 12 golden plates, 12 goblets carved with vines, 12 little salt cellars, each with a different symbol engraved upon it, a star, a lily, a branch of laurel, a quill, and so on. Someone had chosen those symbols with care. Each fairy, the chamberlain explained, would stand in turn at the cradle and bestow a gift upon the princess. Beauty, grace, a gentle voice, a pleasant manner, skill in dancing, a keen mind, and other such blessings. The list of virtues was almost as long as the menu. As he spoke, the younger scullery maids exchanged glances. Fairies were one thing in stories, another when you were told to polish their goblets. One girl, Karine, swallowed and asked what seemed a simple question. Were all the fairies pleased to be summoned like this? The chamberlain gave her a look that said such matters were far above a kitchen servant's concern. Yet I thought it a fair question. No one likes to be treated as one more item on a list, no matter how fine the handwriting. The carriages began to arrive in the early afternoon. From the back door of the hall I could see only glimpses, wheels gilded like the sun, horses plumed and plaited, cloaks that shimmered as their wearers stepped down onto the stone. Some said the fairies came on foot, others that they did not need carriages at all, that the air itself parted to let them through. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. A ripple went through the crowd each time a new guest entered the hall. I watched the servants usher them to the high table. 12 places, laid out with such care that it almost hurt the eye. The golden plates reflected the painted ceiling. The goblets caught the light in their curves. The king and queen greeted each fairy with practised warmth. The ladies of the court studied their dresses and jewels with a mixture of admiration and envy. The men tried to act as though beings from old tales appeared at their feasts every week. And there, at the far end, was the last place set. A plate, a goblet, a chair. The 12th. No more. The first fairy to arrive wore green that seemed woven from the forest itself. The next came in blue, soft as the sky before sunset. They smiled. They nodded. They spoke a few words to one another. Each carried an air of self-possession, as if nothing in that hall could truly unsettle them. Perhaps it is easy to be calm when everyone has gone to such lengths to please you. Yet even from where I stood, I felt a slight awkwardness in the air, like the sensation of a seam not quite aligned in a fine garment. It took me a moment to understand that the courtiers were counting. Not the plates, but the faces. 1, 2, 3. On and on, silently. They remembered, as the chamberlain had remembered, that there were more fairies in the world than those seated at the table. I overheard scraps of conversation as I carried trays through side doors. Has anyone seen her these many years? They say she lives in a lonely tower, away from court. Some swear she is dead. Others say she is only sleeping. No one, it seemed, was certain. But all of them, from the barons in their embroidered coats to the footmen in livery, shared a quiet hope that the fairy who had not been invited would never learn that this feast was taking place. In smaller lives, we do the same. We plan a wedding and choose not to invite a quarrelsome relative, hoping silence will be enough to erase ties of blood. We arrange a gathering at work and leave out the colleague who never quite fits in, telling ourselves they will not mind or even notice. We rely on distance and forgetfulness as if they were kindness. It feels neat at the time. Only later do we see the outlines of those we have excluded, standing just outside the circle of light. Back in the kitchen, I tried to shake off these thoughts. There were sauces to finish, glazes to brush on meat, vegetables to arrange in patterns pleasing enough to impress even a fairy. The ovens roared, steam rose in clouds, knives flashed in quick hands. At least here our tasks were clear. Salt must be measured, timing watched. A roast that arrived 5 minutes too late would do more immediate harm to the day than any slight of etiquette. Even so, when I carried the first great platter into the hall, I could not help letting my eyes run along the length of the high table again. I saw the 12 fairies now seated, their faces varied, but all touched with something that did not belong entirely to this world. Their eyes were bright, their hands slender, their movements precise. The king sat straighter on his throne. The queen's tiredness seemed to lift a little, as if the presence of such guests were a balm. Between the toasts and the music, I caught hints of their conversation. They spoke softly of the child they were about to bless, of the gifts they had chosen, of hopes for her future. One wished her the beauty that turns heads. Another spoke of grace that could soothe quarrels. A third promised a voice so sweet it would make people forget their sorrows when she sang. They sounded almost like doting aunts, and for a moment I wondered if I had misjudged the whole situation. Perhaps all would be well. Perhaps a missing plate was only that. Yet each time someone glanced toward the doorway, I felt my own neck stiffen in sympathy. It is strange how waiting can change the air in a room. Everything was in its proper place. Every plate filled, every goblet brimming. The musicians played. The courtiers laughed. And still, under it all, was the faint, persistent sense that something had been left unfinished. As I left the hall with my empty platter, the sound of the music followed me into the cooler hush of the service passage. My hands were busy, but my mind lingered on that unseen line between invitation and omission, between honor and insult. We like to believe that what we do not name cannot hurt us. We close our doors and trust that those left outside will find comfort elsewhere. But stories, like lives, do not always obey such simple wishes. And as the bells began to ring for the moment of blessing, I found myself asking, though only in the quiet of my own thoughts, whether a feast built on forgetting could ever truly bring peace. The bells that called us to the christening did not ring the way they had on the day of the princess's birth. Then they had laughed in the air, quick and bright. Now they moved more slowly, as if the metal itself had learned caution. Even so, the sound ran through the palace like a stirred pot. Servants straightened their collars, courtiers smoothed their sleeves, and somewhere above our heads a nurse wrapped the baby more tightly in silk. I wiped my hands on a clean cloth, left the warmth of the stoves, and followed the line of flower-bearers toward the great hall, permitted for once to hover at the doorway under the excuse of supervising the dishes. The hall, when I looked in, had changed since the feast began. The long tables were pushed back. At the far end, near the raised dais, stood the cradle. Dark wood polished like chestnut, lined with pale fabric, set high so everyone might see the tiny face. On a smaller table lay the 12 golden plates that had so troubled my thoughts, each with a token. Beside it, a small comb, a narrow book, a flute, a shimmer of ribbon symbols, I supposed, of blessings already chosen. Around the cradle the fairies had gathered, their clothes not quite of our fashion, yet making the room seem as if it were trying to imitate them. The king and queen watched with that mixture of hope and fear I have seen on other parents' faces in humbler rooms, when a child is about to leave for service or stand up to marry. They knew, as all parents know, that love cannot stand guard over every hour of a life. When the music stilled, the first fairy stepped forward and wished the princess beauty, so that hearts would soften at the sight of her. Another promised grace, another a gentle tongue, another a quick understanding, and a heart inclined to kindness. Each gift fell like a petal onto a life that had barely begun, and a soft sigh of satisfaction moved through the hall. Leaning against the doorframe, I thought of children born with no witnesses but a tired midwife and a smoky candle, who receive no formal list of virtues, yet learn to rise early, to keep their word, to share what little they have. No one calls those habits enchantments, but they shape a life as surely as any shining promise. Perhaps we do not name them magic because they demand so much patient work from us. The princess slept on, wrapped in silk and expectation. By the time the 8th fairy had spoken, warmth settled over the hall. Even I, who had distrusted the arithmetic of 12 plates from the beginning, almost believed that careful planning might truly keep sorrow at the threshold. Then came a sound that did not belong to our plans. At first it was only a faint tapping, like an impatient spoon against the side of a pot, but it was too regular, too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. The musicians faltered. Conversations frayed and fell silent. All eyes turned toward the great doors. They opened with a slow weight that made the skin on my arms tighten. In the doorway stood a figure in a cloak the color of storm clouds, leaning on a staff of dark wood. What hair showed beneath the hood was the sharp white of frost, and her eyes, when she lifted her head, burned cold enough to make the candles seem uncertain. I had never seen her, yet every person in that hall knew at once who she was. You did not need a crown to understand. The knowledge passed through the crowd like a draught of winter air. This was the fairy no one had counted in the provisions, the one for whom no golden plate had been set. For a few heartbeats no one spoke. The king lurched to his feet and almost upset his goblet. The queen's hand tightened on the arm of her chair. Some courtiers stepped forward and then back again, as people do when a pot boils over and they are not sure whether to rescue or flee. Only the old fairy moved with purpose. Tap, 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 her staff beating time as she advanced toward the cradle. When trouble enters a room, most eyes look anywhere but at it. Some courtiers suddenly discovered the ceiling, others studied the floor. I have seen the same instinct in markets and kitchens when harsh words begin. We hide in our tasks, pretend to be deaf, and hope that by not meeting anger's gaze, we can make it pass us by. It almost never works. At last, the king found his voice and stammered out words about honor and delight, as if she had merely arrived late. Even from the doorway I heard how thin it sounded. An invitation offered after a guest has already forced the door is only fear in borrowed clothing. The old fairy's mouth tightened, not quite into a smile. Her eyes travelled slowly over the hall, the garlands of flowers, the groaning tables, the 12 plates gleaming on their linen. When she spoke, her voice was dry as autumn leaves. "So," she said, "you have done very well without me." If the clay pots in the scullery could have heard her, they would have flinched. It was not the loudness of the words, but the years inside them. Years in which no one had walked whatever lonely path led to her dwelling. Years in which her name had been mentioned more in fear than in kindness. Neglect, left long enough, begins to imagine itself innocent. On the other side, hurt thickens quietly like mould on forgotten bread. She walked up to the cradle. The other fairies shifted, but did not bar her way. Perhaps there are old rules among their kind that even they do not dare break. Perhaps they too were afraid. Power recognizes power, and not all kinships are gentle. When she spoke her gift, the air seemed to stop moving. She did not speak of beauty or grace. She declared that when the princess reached her 16th year, she would prick her hand on the point of a spindle and fall down dead. The word hung in the hall like smoke that would not rise. Dead. You might wonder how anyone can shape such a wish for a child. Yet, in smaller ways, people pronounce such sentences every day. We say a boy will never be anything but trouble, that a girl is sure to grow bitter like her mother, that a neighbour is useless, faithless, foolish. We repeat it until the judgment feels like fact. There is no glitter to such curses, no staff striking stone, but they work on the mind like slow poison all the same. In the hall, the effect was immediate. The Queen's cry cut through every layer of ceremony. The king stumbled toward the cradle as if his body could shield his daughter from words that had already taken flight. But words once spoken cannot be snatched back like an overcooked dish from a footman's hands. They travel on their own feet. The old fairy turned away, her face almost peaceful. For her, the scale had been balanced. Slight repaid, wound answered. Whether the weight on each side was truly equal did not seem to concern her. That, to me, is the most frightening thing about resentment kept too long in the dark. It changes shape until it feels like pure righteousness. As she neared the door, I pressed myself against the wall to let her pass. For the briefest instant, her gaze flicked toward the narrow passage that led down to the kitchens, and a cold ran through me as if every fire I had ever tended had gone out at once. Then she was gone, back into the places we had preferred not to think about. Behind her she left a hall full of sobbing and confusion. In that turmoil, one fairy still sat silent at the table of golden plates, the youngest, saving her gift for last. How she rose and what she changed belongs to the next turn of the story. For now, when I remember that day, it is not the speeches or the ribbons I hear first, but the sound of a staff on stone, the warning before the words. In our own lives, there are softer knockings we ignore chances to include, to apologize, to mend, because it is easier to turn away and keep our feasts tidy. And we still have to ask whether any peace built on such forgetting can be more than a fragile calm, waiting for its own unwelcome knock. Chaos does not roar at first. It whispers. After the old fairy left the hall, The sound was not a storm, but 100 small noises loosening the seams of order. A goblet tipped and rolled. Someone dropped a fan. A child whimpered. The musicians froze, bows in the air, waiting for a signal that did not come. Even the candle seemed to lean away from the center of the room. The king kept repeating the same word, as if he could argue it into meaning something else. "Dead," he said, his face grey beneath the crown. "Dead." It sounded unfamiliar in that glittering room, a word from battlefields and sick rooms dragged in among silk and gold. The queen did not speak at all. She bent over the cradle, her hand hovering above her child, as if afraid to touch her. From my place at the doorway, I felt as helpless as a cook facing a dish already burnt. Once the fire has done its work, all the skill in the world cannot restore what is gone. You can only scrape away the worst of the blackened crust, save what can be saved, and begin again. I thought that was all that lay ahead of us. Yet there was still one person in that hall who had not spoken. At the table of golden plates, the youngest fairy rose. She had sat so still that some had forgotten she was there. Her dress was less ornate than the others, her jewels smaller, her expression thoughtful rather than dazzling. Now, as she stepped forward, the mood of the room shifted the way air changes just before rain. It was not that she looked powerful, it was that she looked attentive, as if every word and every silence mattered. She bowed to the king and queen, then went straight to the cradle. The baby slept on, mouth slightly open, fists curled. The young fairy stood a moment without speaking, and in that pause I could almost feel her weighing possibilities the way I weigh ingredients. This much sorrow, that much hope, what can be salvaged from what remains? When she finally spoke, her voice carried clearly even to the doorway. She could not undo the old fairy's words. Magic, it seems, has its own strict accounting. A gift once given, even a cruel one, cannot simply be snatched back. But she could bend its direction. The princess, she declared, would indeed prick her hand on a spindle on the appointed day. She would fall, but not into death. Instead, she would sink into a deep sleep that would last 100 years, at the end of which a king's son would come and awaken her. A murmur moved through the hall, a ripple of relief, thin but real. Death had been pushed back, exchanged for something people could speak of without the same raw edge. Sleep. We know sleep. We surrender to it every night, trusting that morning will call us back. Still, as I listened, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. 100 years is a long time to be away from the world, even if one does not feel the hours passing. The queen lifted her eyes with the look of someone thrown a rope while hanging from a cliff. The king seized on the word sleep as a drowning man seizes driftwood. He thanked the young fairy with a rush of gratitude that sounded almost like apology. Around them, courtiers began to breathe again, rearranging their shock into more manageable forms. People are quick to adjust their feelings to what can be endured, especially when duty demands a composed face. As for me, I stood in the doorway and tried to imagine the palace 100 years from now. The ovens cold, the kitchens empty, ivy grown thick over the windows, the names of the servants forgotten while legends grew around the princess who did not age. It was like picturing my own work vanishing under dust. We tell ourselves that life will go on without us, but it is another thing to hear it measured so precisely. When the fairies had finished their gifts and the last blessing hung in the air like a faint sweetness, after a strong meal they departed. Some vanished swiftly, like light slipping behind a cloud. Others left more slowly, skirts whispering over stone. The youngest fairy glanced once toward the servants near the side doors. Our eyes did not quite meet, yet I had the impression she was asking us to remember something, though I could not have said what. Once they were gone, the king acted as kings often do when faced with something they cannot fully control. He reached for the nearest weapon available, not a sword, but a decree. No spinning wheel was to remain in the kingdom. From that day forward, anyone keeping a spindle would answer to the crown. Men with axes and sharper orders were sent out to search town and country. Those at court praised his wisdom. Something had been done, they said. Measures were being taken. In the kitchens we heard the news with mixed feelings. We did not spin, but we knew the women who did. They came to the back door to sell their linen and yarn, hands rough from work that had fed their families for generations. What were they to do now? A tool can be burned in an afternoon. A way of life cannot be so easily replaced. Yet no one dared say this loudly within the palace walls. Outwardly, the decree looked like protection. Inwardly, it carried the taste of fear, disguised as firmness. Soon after, I walked through the courtyard and saw a great fire blazing in the centre. Piled around it were spinning wheels of every size and shape, some so old their wood had turned smooth as polished breadboards, others new and barely darkened by use. Flames licked at their spokes and whirls, turning them to black skeletons before they crumbled to ash. The king stood at a window above, watching with clenched jaw. No one told him that burning a wheel does not erase the idea of spinning, any more than breaking a knife makes the memory of cutting disappear. As I watched the smoke rise, I thought of how often we deal with danger in this way. We focus on the object we can see and destroy it, hoping that will end the threat. We ban books without asking why they disturb us. We cut down trees and are surprised when the wind changes. We forbid questions rather than sit with the discomfort they bring. Fire is easier to light than patience, yet we still have to wonder whether such actions truly keep us safe or simply change the shape of the risks we face. Inside the palace, life slowly returned to its bright routines. The princess grew. Her cradle gave way to a bed. Her first steps sounded in the corridors. Her laughter floated down stairwells and sometimes reached the kitchen, where we listened with a tenderness we would never have shown our own weariness. She was the child everyone had nearly lost. People cannot live in crisis forever. In time, the terror of that early day blurred into something like a half-remembered dream. Years passed. New servants came. Older ones, like me, grew greyer around the temples. We moved through our tasks with the quiet confidence of those who have tasted catastrophe and found that mornings still follow nights. Yet, beneath all the ordinary concerns, there remained a thin line on the calendar of every mind, the year the princess would turn 16. We pretended not to count, but we all did, in one way or another. And somewhere beyond the reach of decrees and bonfires, in a forgotten tower or a lonely cottage, a spindle waited, not out of malice, perhaps, but simply because the world is larger than any king's command. That, more than any prophecy, is what keeps stories like this moving. We conceal doors, extinguish embers, silence whispers, yet there will always be some narrow stair, some overlooked room, some small sharp point of reality that refuses to vanish simply because we are afraid of being pricked. The princess did not grow all at once into the young woman the world remembers. She grew day by day, like bread in a warm oven, so slowly that those closest to her hardly noticed the change until they turned and saw that the little bundle in the cradle had become a tall girl walking beside them. From the kitchen we watched her childhood pass in fragments, glimpsed through doorways and caught in echoes along the stone corridors. I first heard her laughter clearly one spring morning when she was perhaps 7. I was kneading dough near the open door, the air thick with the smell of yeast and flour, when a high, bright sound floated down the back stair. It was followed by the heavier tread of the nurse and the rustle of attendants' skirts. The princess ran ahead of them, her shoes tapping unevenly on the steps, her hair escaping from its ribbons. She stopped at the threshold of the kitchen, eyes wide, as if she had stepped into a foreign land. To a child raised among embroidered cushions and polished floors, our world must have seemed impossibly rough. The walls were stained with years of smoke. Pots of every size hung from blackened hooks. The table was dusted not with powder, but with flour. The jewels here were only drops of fat shining on a hot pan. Yet she looked at it all with something like delight, not disgust. Her nose wrinkled at the smell of onions, then smoothed as the scent of baking bread pushed forward. "What is that?" she asked, pointing to a pot from which steam escaped in steady puffs. Her nurse hurried forward, ready to draw her back. The king and queen, fearing both illness and accidents, had forbidden their daughter to wander into the more dangerous parts of the palace. But the princess had already taken a step inside, curiosity stronger than caution. I bowed, though my apron was stained, and my hands were sticky, and told her it was soup, thickened with barley and vegetables from the garden. "Will everyone eat it?" she asked. "Not at your table, Highness," I said as gently as I could. "This is for the servants. You will have finer dishes." For a moment she looked troubled, as if the idea of different meals for different mouths had not yet taken root in her. Then, with a kind of shy eagerness, she asked if she might taste it. The nurse made a sound halfway between shock and protest, but the princess stood her ground. I gave her a spoonful, barely warm, blown on until it would not burn her tongue. She tasted it with the same attention a court lady might give a rare wine. "It is good," she said. "It tastes honest." The word surprised me. How does a child find such a word for barley and cabbage? The nurse whisked her away a moment later, scolding softly about unsuitable places and stains on dresses. But as the years went on, she returned to the kitchen more often, sometimes under pretext of visiting the herb garden, sometimes under the thin excuse of seeking a cooler breeze. As she grew older, the gifts of the fairies showed themselves, just as they had promised in that glittering, terrible hall. She moved with a grace that made the most ordinary gestures look like part of a dance. When she spoke, even to a scullery maid, her voice carried a warmth people felt long after the words themselves faded. She learned songs quickly, and sang them with a sweetness that drifted down to us when she passed an open stairwell. The elders at court nodded approvingly. Everything, they said, is as it should be. Only the youngest fairy's gift, the one that turned death into sleep, remained invisible, like a seed lying under snow. The old curse, too, slept out of sight. No one spoke of it in the princess's hearing. It was as if the royal couple believed that by never naming the danger, they could keep it from taking shape. The king grew more cautious with every passing year. Guards were doubled. Doors were locked. Servants were instructed never to mention spinning in the girl's presence, as if the very idea of twisted fibres might cut her. In our own houses, we sometimes do the same. We avoid speaking of illness to the sick, of money to the poor, of grief to the grieving, thinking we are sparing them pain. Yet silence can be its own kind of burden. A child kept from all knowledge of sharp objects will still one day meet a knife. The question is whether she will recognize it and know how to hold it, or reach for it blindly and be surprised by the blood. On her 12th birthday, the palace held another feast. Smaller than the christening, but still grand enough to keep the kitchen awake all night. I remember bringing up trays of sugared fruit and seeing her at the high table, no longer a child fidgeting in her chair, but a young girl sitting so straight that her necklace lay in a perfect line against her dress. She thanked every servant who approached with a word and a smile. Most royals forget the faces that bring them their food, but she seemed to look at each of us as if we were part of the same world as her tutors and ladies. It is a small thing, a thank you, but in a life built from small things, it is one of the bricks that keeps the wall from crumbling. Rumours of the old prophecy still circled among the older servants like a draught that will not be shut out, however tightly one closes the doors. We watched her with a double vision, seeing both the girl before us and the shadow of the 16-year-old she would become. Some counted the years on their fingers after a long day's work. Others marked the passage of time by changes in her face. Only 4 more winters, someone would say, as we peeled turnips. Only 3, murmured another, as she passed the kitchen door with a basket of flowers. We never spoke of it when she was near, but it coloured our thoughts all the same. The king ordered regular searches of the palace, as if some stray spindle might grow legs and climb in from outside. Attics were cleared. Old trunks opened. Forgotten closets swept. We saw squads of men tramping through corridors that normally only dust frequented. They carried torches and spoke loudly, perhaps to convince themselves that nothing truly dangerous could lurk among old blankets and broken chairs. It was a strange theatre of safety, the show of control standing in for the thing itself. Yet, for all the checking and burning and forbidding, life could not be held entirely still. New traders came to town, unaware of old decrees. Children in distant villages played at spinning with sticks and thread, not knowing their game brushed against a royal fear. The world beyond the palace walls went on weaving and unweaving its days, indifferent to one kingdom's attempt to outlaw a craft that had fed generations. When the princess was about 14, I met her one late afternoon in the herb garden that bordered the kitchen yard. I was cutting thyme and rosemary for a stew when I heard the swish of her skirts on the path behind me. She asked what the herbs were for, and I told her. Then she surprised me by kneeling to touch the plants, breathing in their scents with serious concentration. "Does the food taste of these?" she asked, "or do they only pretend to change it?" I smiled and said they draw out what is already there, make the ordinary more itself. She was silent for a moment, then said softly that perhaps blessings work that way too. The fairies may have given me certain gifts, she mused, but they only make larger what I choose to practice. If I am unkind, no charm will turn my words sweet. I looked at her then properly, seeing not only the shining surface of her enchantments, but the mind behind them. It comforted me more than all the guards and decrees. A girl who thinks in such terms has some armour against the sharper wheels of life. Still, as her 16th year crept closer, a tension settled over the palace like a thin layer of dust on everything. The Queen's smiles grew a little tighter at the edges. The King spent more time in the council chamber, as if important papers could distract him from the date approaching as surely as any winter. In the kitchen, we found ourselves double-checking tasks we could have done with our eyes closed, as if doing the ordinary things perfectly might somehow influence the extraordinary hour we all half feared, half expected. We like to trust that care and planning will shield those we love from every harm. We child-proof our homes, we build fences, we lock gates, we hide the very words that frighten us. But as I watched the princess stepping with light feet along corridors that had been combed and cleaned 100 times, I still found myself wondering whether protection that never admits danger truly prepares a person for the moment when life, in spite of everything, sets a sharp point in their path. The day the princess turned 16 began like any other feast day in the kitchens, with the sound of knives, not trumpets. Before the sun had properly lifted itself above the trees, we were already awake, hands deep in flour and fat, minds half on recipes and half on the date marked silently in our thoughts. Years of watching her grow had brought us to this morning. For all the king's orders and the queen's prayers, the old fairy's promise had ripened with the girl it targeted. I had slept poorly. Dreams of spinning wheels creaked through my mind, though none remained in the palace. The fire was sullen when I came down, slow to catch, as if even the logs were reluctant to begin this day. Still, work waits for no prophecy. I checked the stores, barked gentle orders, and tied on my apron with hands that felt clumsier than usual. The king had decided there would be a celebration, though smaller than the one at her birth. No fairies this time. No golden plates reserved for beings half feared, half flattered. Only neighbours, a few allied lords, and enough music to drown out the uneasy silence that had been gathering in corners for months. On the formal list, it would be recorded as a birthday feast. In the private ledger of hearts, it was an attempt to distract ourselves from a ticking clock we could not see. As the morning wore on, the palace filled with its familiar festival noises. Carriages rumbled over the stones, voices rose and fell in the courtyard. In the hall above, servants laid out cloths and polished cups until they could see their own anxious faces staring back. Down below, we prepared dishes that looked like celebration: glazed hams, spiced fowl, platters of fruit so carefully arranged they resembled flowers. Yet, beneath the clatter and steam, there was a strain in the air we could not season away. The younger servants moved with forced cheerfulness. The older ones kept glancing at the clock on the wall. One boy dropped the same spoon 3 times until I sent him out to breathe in the yard. We were all waiting for something we did not want to see, watching for a shadow we hoped would never fall. The princess came to the kitchen once that morning. She had been allowed a little more freedom as she grew, and on happier days she would slip in with a question or a quick remark, before being gently escorted back to the safer parts of the palace. Today she entered alone, no nurse at her shoulder, wearing a simple gown the colour of new cream. 16 suits a face in a particular way. Childhood softness lingers at the edges, but there is something in the gaze that looks further forward than before. We bowed or curtsied as we could in our flowery chaos. She laughed and told us not to stop working on her account. For a few moments she walked among the tables, dipping a finger into a bowl of icing, sniffing a pot where cinnamon bark floated on the surface. I noticed she moved a little more slowly than usual, as if listening to something inside herself. "Are you well, Highness?" I asked when she drew near my station. She tilted her head and seemed to weigh the question. "It feels like any other day," she said, "and yet everyone looks at me as if I might break." Her smile faded. "I know there are things you all do not say when I come into a room. It is like seeing people hide a book whenever you step through the door." I hesitated. The king's order against speaking of the old curse had never been formally lifted. But I am a cook, not a courtier. My loyalty is to those I feed as much as to the rules pinned up on walls. I chose my words carefully. "There are stories tied to your birth," I said, as gently as I could. "Stories of danger and of protection. Those above hope that by not naming one, they can lean more securely on the other." She considered that, the way she had once considered the taste of soup in my spoon. "If a knife is in the drawer," she replied, "not naming it does not keep it from being sharp." Her eyes were clear, not frightened. A person can grow up in a guarded garden and still recognize a thorn when they see one. Perhaps the youngest fairy's blessing had given her more than a future prince. Perhaps it had also sown in her the habit of looking plainly at what others preferred to blur. "If you could," she asked softly, "would you keep me a child a little longer?" I answered honestly. "Childhood has its own hunger," I said. "To keep you from growing would be its own kind of curse." She smiled then, more lightly. "I thought as much," she said. "When my mother smooths my hair, her hands say, 'Stay small.' When my tutors speak of duty, their eyes say, 'Hurry.' It seems I cannot please both." She thanked us for our work, wished us an easy day, which was a wish even magic could not grant, and turned to leave. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. "Whatever happens," she said, "you have fed me well. It is a strange blessing, perhaps, but in the life of a cook it sits close to the heart." After she was gone, the kitchen felt emptier than it had any right to be, given how crowded it was with bodies and noise. The hours crawled. The sun climbed and began its slow descent. We sent dish after dish up to the great hall, where guests gathered, laughed, and speculated about what gifts the king might bestow on his only child. For a while, the reports we heard from above were ordinary. The princess greeted each guest with grace. She danced once with a young lord whose steps were not entirely sure. She received small tokens and said the right words in response. Life, in other words, carried on balancing itself at the edge of an unseen cliff. It was sometime in the later afternoon, while I was overseeing a tray of pastries so delicate that a harsh word might have made them collapse, that I noticed a change. One of the maids came rushing down the back stair, her face pale beneath her freckles. She stopped at the bottom, clearly about to speak, then bit her lip and glanced around as if afraid the walls might overhear. I sent her on an errand for more plates just to give her something to hold while she steadied herself. When she returned, she told me in a low rush that the princess had slipped away from the festivities. No one had seen quite where she went. One moment she had been standing near a window, looking out as if something had caught her eye. The next, after a swirl of guests passed between, she was gone. The queen had assumed she had only stepped into an antechamber for air, but minutes were stretching in a way that felt inconvenient for a mere breath. Young people vanish for moments at parties all the time. They seek quiet corners or stray to look at the sky, or suddenly remember a book left open elsewhere. Yet, with the old story shimmering behind every thought, this ordinary disappearance tightened hearts more than it might have on another day. I told the maid not to gossip and sent her back up. Inwardly, I felt the world tilt, as if we were all standing on a plate that had been nudged just a little off balance. Someone said later that the princess had noticed a narrow door half hidden behind a tapestry, one she had never opened before. Another swore they had seen her at the base of the old tower staircase, hand resting on the worn stone of the banister, eyes bright with the small and irresistible thrill of discovering a place that had somehow escaped every map of her daily life. Old buildings collect such forgotten corners. So do our own minds. We walk the same halls of habit until one day a curtain stirs and shows us a passage we had been stepping past for years. I did not see her put her foot on that first step. I did not hear the creak of the spiral stairs as she climbed. I was in the kitchen, watching a pot that had begun to bubble too fiercely, scolding a boy for letting the bread brown unevenly, trying to pretend that this birthday was only a birthday and not a turning point in more than one life. Yet sometimes I think I felt a kind of echo, a faint pulling in the air, as if somewhere above a door was opening that would not easily be closed again. In our own days, too, we come to such hidden thresholds. We follow a curiosity up a narrow stair, open a door that has always been there but never used, and find inside not only something new, but also the sharp point of consequences waiting patiently for us to arrive. Old buildings keep their own secrets. You can sweep the floors, mend the roofs, repaint the walls in fashionable colours, and still there will be corners that belong more to dust than to sunlight. Our palace was no different. There were staircases that led nowhere anyone important needed to go, doors that stuck from disuse, rooms that remembered old servants better than new kings. We walked past them every day with our arms full of trays and linens, thinking only of where we had to be next. Later, when everyone tried to piece together what had happened, the path of the princess's last walk before the sleep was traced by such unnoticed places. A page had seen her near the long gallery, eyes turned toward the high windows. A moment later, a maid passing through an antechamber found the curtain over a small side door still quivering, as if someone had just brushed past. Another servant swore he heard light footsteps on the tower stairs, but by the time he reached the bottom, there was only silence and the faint smell of dust. It is strange how clearly people remember what they did not quite see when they are given a story to hang their memories on. We gathered their fragments afterward like crumbs on a tablecloth. A narrow door half hidden behind a faded tapestry. A spiral staircase turning upward into dimness, the kind of place every grown-up eye had learned to look past, and every young one longed to explore. I had climbed such stairs in my early years as a kitchen boy, searching for mislaid platters or chasing a runaway cat. I remembered how the air changed as you went up, cooler at first, then suddenly close and stale, full of old cobwebs and the dry breath of forgotten things. Your footsteps sound different on such steps too. Down below, stone answers briskly. Higher up, the echoes turn uncertain, as if the building is surprised to hear from you. The princess, raised among well-swept corridors and mapped-out routines, must have felt a thrill with each turn. For once, she was somewhere that had not been smoothed and softened in advance for her sake. The dust on the railing marked her fingers. The light thinned into strips through narrow slits of window. Her skirt brushed against the rough wall, collecting little grey kisses from places no one thought important. At the top of the stairs was a door she had never seen opened. The servants' tales agreed on that much. It gave way at her touch with a reluctant creak, like a throat clearing after years of disuse. Inside was a small room, low-ceilinged, its only window smeared with the grime of decades. A few pieces of furniture crouched against the walls, a chest, a stool, a narrow bed. In the middle, under the strangest beam of light, stood an old woman. She was bent over a spinning wheel, one foot on the treadle, hands drawing out a thin thread that gleamed in the dusty air. To the princess, who had been forbidden even the word spinning, the sight must have seemed half magic, half miracle. A wheel turning, a foot pressing, a bundle of loose fibres becoming a line strong enough to tie things together. Everything her parents had tried to keep from her sat here, calmly whirring, in the hands of a woman who looked like she belonged to another age. The old woman, they said, wore a cap as yellow as old parchment, and a dress that might once have been blue. Her face was wrinkled in the way of faces that have smiled and frowned more often than they have rested. She had been forgotten by nearly everyone below, tucked away long ago to tend old linens and mended things, and had not heard of royal decrees against her craft. No chamberlain had climbed the tower to confiscate her wheel. No guard had thought such a crooked figure could matter to the fate of a princess. When the door opened, she started, hand slipping on the thread. Then she saw who stood there, and blinked, owlish and slow. To her, perhaps, the princess was only a very fine young girl who had lost her way. Another mouth that might, with luck, remember to bring bread on a winter afternoon. "What are you doing?" the princess asked her. I imagine her voice was breathless, but not from fear. Curiosity has its own kind of quickness. The old woman, half-deaf from a life lived in murmurs and spinning song, heard enough to smile and answer in the only way that ever seemed to matter to her. "I am pinning, my child." Those 4 words were the crossroads where 2 lives met. One that had looped quietly through unremarked years, and one that had been mapped in whispers since its first breath. The princess stepped closer, enchanted by the dance of the wheel and the thread. She had been surrounded by gifts all her life, but here was something made not by magic, not by decree, but by steady hands and patient feet. Perhaps that difference drew her like a scent. She asked if she might try. No one had ever asked the old woman for such a thing before. Servants brought her wool and took away the finished skeins without much more than a nod. To be admired by the royal child for the very work that had kept her tucked away must have felt like sunlight falling on a window too long shuttered. So she agreed. I was not there, but I can see it as clearly as if I had been. The old woman makes room on the stool. The princess gathers her skirts and sits. Her fingers reach for the spindle with the clumsiness of inexperience. The wood is smooth from years of being held, warmed by the old woman's touch. The wheel turns. The thread pulls. For a moment, all is well. Then the inevitable happens. A gesture too quick, a twist too sudden. The point of the spindle, so small it can be hidden in a handful of wool, meets the tender skin of a finger. There is no great wound, no river of blood, just a bright bead the size of a berry seed, blossoming where flesh and wood have argued. The princess starts more from surprise than pain. Her hand jerks back. The thread snaps. Down in the kitchen, at that same instant, I was arguing with a boy about the proper way to skim fat from a sauce. On days like that, the ordinary quarrels feel almost comforting. They remind us that not everything is prophecy and fear. Yet even as I opened my mouth, something in the air changed. It was as if the palace took a single sharp breath. Up in the tower room, the princess swayed. A great drowsiness ran through her limbs, heavier than any sleep she had ever known. She barely had time to touch the edge of the bed before she fell upon it, eyes closed, breath soft. The old woman cried out once, in alarm, and then her own eyelids drooped. The spell, like spilled oil, spread quickly wherever life flickered. We often speak of accidents as if they happen outside any pattern, as if a slip of the hand or a missed step is separate from all that came before. But as the girl's blood touched the spindle, years of fear, secrecy, and avoidance came together in that single tiny point. A wheel turned, a thread broke, a life tipped from waking into enchantment. And if we are honest, we must ask ourselves how many of our own mishaps are really the places where long-laid paths finally meet the sharp realities we have tried so hard not to name. News travels strangely when it does not use doors. No messenger ran down to the kitchen crying that the princess had fallen. No trumpet sounded a warning note. Yet, almost at once, a stillness began to spread through the palace, as if someone had laid a cool hand on its racing heart. I was lifting a pan from the fire when it happened. One moment, the kitchen was full of clatter and talk. A boy beside me was arguing about the best way to season a sauce. A girl was laughing at a joke half finished. A pot was just beginning to boil over. Then, without so much as a gust of wind, sound thinned. The boy's words trailed into silence. The girl's laugh hung in the air like a note cut short. The pot bubbled one last time, and then stilled, though the fire still glowed beneath it. I set the pan down and turned, a reprimand ready on my tongue. It never left my mouth. The boy who had been talking stood frozen, head tilted, eyes half closed. The girl's hand still clutched a ladle, but her fingers had slackened. One by one, my staff folded where they stood, like flowers closing at dusk. A scullion sank gently to the floor, his back against the cupboard. The spit boy slumped on his stool, face peaceful for the first time that day. No one cried out, no one struggled. Sleep came down like a soft, heavy cloth. I had just time to think, so this is it, before my own lids grew impossibly heavy. The stone floor rose. to meet me more kindly than I would have expected after years on my feet. The last thing I remember seeing is a loaf of bread sliding slowly from the table, caught halfway by the arm of a baker who would never have trusted luck so much if he had been awake. What happened next in the upper rooms, I know only from what others pieced together later, and from the traces left behind when we woke. The same great gentleness moved through the halls. Guards fell asleep leaning on their spears. Ladies dozed in the middle of gossip, fans still raised. The king's head sank back against the high curve of his chair, the strain of years smoothing from his brow. The queen, they say, managed to reach the bedside where her daughter lay and fall asleep with one hand resting on the girl's blanket. Even the flames in the torches seemed to pause, caught in a moment between leap and fall. Outside, the wind wandered around the towers, found no one at the battlements, and went about its own business. Time, which had been counting so carefully toward this day, found itself suddenly holding a palace in which every heartbeat had slowed to an almost silent rhythm. It might have gone on like that, a frozen scene waiting for dust and decay to finish what the spindle had begun, had the youngest fairy not remembered the promise she had made at the christening. Far away, how far? No one can say exactly. She felt the tug of the spell she had bent, but could not break. Magic, like memory, leaves a thread behind. When something plucks it, those tied to it feel the disturbance. She took up her cloak and her wand, and came as quickly as beings of her kind come, which is not measured in miles or hours, as we know them. Some say she rode a chariot of fire. Others insist she simply appeared at the edge of the forest, her feet barely bruising the grass. However it was, she arrived. She found the palace as I had last seen my kitchen, not dead, not alive, but held in a breath that refused to finish. She walked through the outer court, past grooms sleeping beside horses that stood motionless, eyes half-lidded mid-chew. She climbed the stairs, skirts whispering against stone, and saw servants sprawled in attitudes of sudden rest. A footman slumped with his hand still on a door latch. A maid curled up with a bundle of laundry in her arms like a child. At last she entered the room where the princess lay on the narrow bed in the forgotten tower. An old woman snoring softly in her stool beside the silent wheel. The girl's face was calm, cheeks touched with the faintest colour. If not for the absence of any stir at her throat, she might have been only napping after a long day. The fairy looked at her for a long time, the way a craftsman studies a piece of work that has gone wrong and yet might still be saved. She had done what she could years before, turning death to sleep and promising that in 100 years a king's son would come to wake the girl. But magic does not end with the first attempt. She understood something the king and queen had never fully grasped. To let the princess sleep while leaving the rest of us awake would be to condemn her not only to separation from her own time, but to a future full of loss and loneliness. So she lifted her wand again, not in anger this time, but in something like pity. If the girl must sleep, then let no one she loves be forced to live out the years without her. If she must wake to a changed world, let it not be one in which she alone has been stolen from the flow of days. With a few quiet words, it is said, true spells are rarely shouted. She sent a new enchantment down through the stones. One by one, the sleepers around the princess were folded into a deeper rest, their dreams drawn out to match hers. The queen at her side, the king in his hall, the courtiers, the servants, the dogs in the yard, the cats in the cellars. Even the flies in the corners all were gently bound to the same long night. In the kitchen, the boy with the spoon, the girl with the ladle, the baker reaching for his falling loaf, and I myself sank beyond even the possibility of waking until the appointed hour. Outside, she turned her attention to the palace's defences, not the walls and gates the king's engineers had planned, but something older and more patient. It would not do to have curious adventurers wandering in and out of this sleeping kingdom. Stories have a way of attracting the wrong kind of bravery. So she called upon the hedges and the brambles that lurked at the edges of the grounds, the seeds sleeping in the soil, the roots that had always wanted more room. Under her guidance, thorns grew, thick and fast. Briars wove themselves into a wall more stubborn than stone, branches twisted together, leaves hiding the sharpness beneath a cloak of green. In time, roses would climb there too, as if to soften the barrier with beauty. But the first growth was all defence, each thorn a small, hard promise. Not yet, not now. Turn back. The paths leading to the gates were swallowed, the flagstones cracked under the slow pressure of roots. From a distance, the palace began to vanish into a living hill of green silence. Here again I see a pattern that belongs not only to tales. When we cannot fix a wound, we sometimes wrap it in layers of protection so thick that no one, including ourselves, can get close. We build hedges of habit and excuses, walls of busyness and noise. We tell ourselves we are guarding something precious, and often we are. Yet we still have to wonder whether the same barriers that keep danger out also keep necessary change standing helplessly at the edge, looking for a way in. For us inside, there was no sense of time passing, no hunger, no thirst, no discomfort. We did not dream of the years stacking themselves outside like plates after a banquet. The great clock in the hall must have frozen, its pendulum arrested in mid-swing. The fire in the kitchen, deprived of hands to tend it, cooled and left only grey ash and a faint trace of smoke clinging to the rafters. The kingdom beyond the brambles moved on without us. Children grew, old men died. Fashions changed, songs faded, and new ones were learned. People in the villages told stories. At first they spoke of the day no one came out of the palace, of the road gone strangely quiet, of birds flying over the walls and not returning. Then, as seasons turned, they added thorns and enchantments, brave men lost among the briars, a princess too beautiful for ordinary sleep. We became a lesson told to children who would never taste our bread or hear our bells. Do not go where you are not invited, they were told. Do not poke at what sleeps. Respect the boundaries that rise where stories grow thick. But boundaries, like hedges, are not forever. Thorns dry, roots rot. New paths form where feet press often enough. Somewhere beyond the horizon of our long night, a boy grew into a young man who listened more carefully than most when old tales were told by the fire. While we lay as still as loaves waiting in a cold oven, something in him was rising, preparing, without his knowing it, to test the truth of the words that had been spoken over our princess, and through her over every one of us who had followed her into that enforced rest. From the kitchen floor where I slept, cheek on the cool stone, I knew nothing of this. Yet when I woke, much later, with my hand still reaching for a pot that no longer boiled, I would taste in the air the echo of that fairy's second kindness, that if one life must leap 100 years in a heartbeat, it is better not to leap alone. I woke as if I had only blinked. One moment my cheek was on the cool kitchen floor, my hand reaching for a pot, my mouth half open to scold a boy. The next, my eyes snapped wide. Same stone, same stretch of fingers, same unfinished word. Only the fire beneath the pot was a bed of grey ash, and a thin film of dust lay over everything, like flour sifted by an invisible hand. For a heartbeat, I thought I had merely fainted. I pushed myself upright, joints protesting as if I had slept on stone for a year. The kitchen, which had never once been truly silent in all my service, was utterly still. No clatter of knives, no splash of water, no low hum of voices. Yet the boy beside me stood exactly where I remembered him, spoon in hand, mouth half open. His eyes blinked, bewildered, like a man shaken awake on the wrong morning. Around us, the others came to themselves in the same strange way. A girl rubbed her face with floury fingers and frowned at the loaf she had not known she was still holding. The baker caught a falling bread and stared at it as if it had dropped from the ceiling. Someone muttered a half-remembered prayer. Someone else swore the room had gone dark and light again, between one breath and the next. We all felt oddly stiff, as though our bones and the day no longer agreed on the same hour. On the tables, the feast for the princess's 16th birthday had become a mockery of celebration. Glazes had dulled, sauces thickened into skins, leaves of garnish lay flat and colourless. Yet nothing stank. Meat that should have rotted by nightfall lay dry at the edges but unspoiled, as if time had passed without quite finishing its work. Dust lay on the ladles, but there were no flies, no sourness, only the flat, closed-in taste of a room that had been forgotten. Then the castle bells began to ring. The sound shook the last shadows from our skulls. Bells do not move without a hand on the rope. Their notes poured down the stairs, bright and astonished, like voices hearing themselves after a long illness. We scrambled to our feet, some stumbling, some crossing themselves, some babbling about earthquakes and miracles. I lurched to the nearest window and shoved it open. The hinges complained like old men woken before dawn. Where I remembered a clear view of the courtyard and the road beyond, I saw a wall of green. Briars as thick as my arm twisted together, armour-plated with thorns and heavy rosebuds. They rose higher than the towers, a living rampart. Yet right in front of the kitchen a tunnel had opened through that tangle, its leaves still shivering from recent disturbance. A path had been pressed through a hedge that must have taken years to grow, and it had appeared as if in the space of a sigh. Later, when stories were compared like recipes, we heard of the prince. In a neighbouring land, an old man by a hearth had told him of a hidden palace where everyone slept, and of the forest of thorns that guarded it. Other young men, the old one said, had gone seeking glory. They had hacked at the briars with bright swords and bold words, and the hedge had folded over them as water closes over a thrown stone. This one, they said, listened more than he boasted, He asked not only where the road lay, but how the tale had changed over time. Some insisted the place was haunted by furious spirits. Others swore a curse struck down any who approached. A few, almost shyly, mentioned a princess who slept and would one day wake. The prince heard fear and bravado and hope all knotted together, and answered only that a story left waiting for so long deserved at least one honest witness. When he rode to the edge of the forest, he found the hedge as cruel and thick as rumour had painted it. Thorns glinted like steel, birds shunned the branches. Yet as he neared, the brambles seemed to draw breath. Their snarls loosened. Their points turned aside. The branches arched overhead to make a vaulted passage, a green hall leading straight toward our forgotten gate. He did not need to cut his way through at all. It was as if the story itself had decided to let him in. He crossed the courtyard and saw what I would soon see. Grooms slumped beside standing horses, guards dozing mid-watch, a dog lying mid-scratch. He tied his own horse and climbed the steps, passing servants who woke exactly as he walked by, rubbing their eyes, stepping aside without quite knowing why. A footman swore afterward that the young man's face held a quiet apology, as if he were both sorry to disturb us and glad to do it. Some instinct stronger than maps drew him higher. Up stair after stair he went, to the oldest parts of the palace, where dust lay thick, and doors complained when touched. At last he reached the little room at the top of the tower, where the youngest fairy's promise had been keeping watch. There he found the princess, just as she had lain when the spindle pricked her hand. She rested on the narrow bed, hair spread like dark water over the pillow, hands folded lightly on the coverlet. The old woman's spinning wheel crouched nearby, its spindle still faintly stained. Dust covered floor and stool and rafters, but none lay on the princess herself. Even time, it seemed, had hesitated to touch her. They say he fell in love with her beauty on the spot. Perhaps he did. The fairies had been generous. But I like to think he also saw the injustice of all that stolen time, the loneliness of a life held at the edge of a breath for 100 silent years. He had come because of a legend. Now he stood before the person who had borne the weight of that legend without ever choosing it. He leaned down and kissed her, not like a man claiming a prize, but like one traveller greeting another who has waited far too long at the crossroads. At that touch, the great spell did not explode. It simply let go. In the same instant, in the same breath, something inside my own chest jerked fully awake, as if my heart had remembered a note it was meant to keep. The kitchen roared back into life. Someone sneezed at the dust. A pan clanged to the floor. A girl shrieked that the meat was ruined. Above us, voices rose in bewildered waves. Doors banged, feet pounded, laughter and tears tangled together as people discovered they were still alive in a world that no longer quite matched the one they remembered. The bells swung harder, not out of duty now, but out of real joy, their bronze throats spilling sound over the thorny hill we had become. Old men later insisted that a full century had slipped by while we slept, just as the fairy had declared. To us, it had been no more than the space between question and answer. We had been spared the slow ache of watching our children grow old, of burying our friends, of counting the new lines in the mirror. The world outside had not been spared. It had carried on without us, And now we stepped back into it, without having walked its long, difficult road. In our smaller lives, too, something like this can happen. We move through our days half awake, repeating old habits, putting off difficult truths until some kindness or shock touches us like that prince's kiss. Then we look around and realize time has been working on everything but our own understanding. Dust on our plans and strange light on familiar walls tell us that more has changed than we wanted to admit. And we still have to choose what to do with that new wakefulness, whether to pretend nothing is different or to honor the silent years by living the ones ahead of us more consciously than before. For all that 100 years had passed, the first sound that truly told me we were alive again was not the bells or the shouting. It was my own stomach, growling like an old dog. Whatever enchantment had kept us from hunger while we slept had let go at the same moment as the spell on our eyes. Life came back in all its ordinary needs. Within minutes of waking, people who had slept through a century were asking the same question they always asked after a long service or a sermon that ran too long. When do we eat? The prince is only... The damn prince, it seemed, had thought of everything except the menu. Word came down from the hall in a rush. The princess was awake. The king and queen had embraced her with tears and laughter that made up in intensity what they lacked in continuity. The mysterious young man at her bedside had named himself a prince from a neighboring kingdom. He had fallen in love with their daughter, he said, and wished to marry her. The king, who had just discovered he still had a daughter, a kingdom, and a beating heart after all, was more inclined to gratitude than suspicion. All this I heard in fragments between shouted orders. I had no time to stand and gape. The same magic that had preserved our bodies had done nothing for the food we had been preparing. The dishes for the 16th birthday feast lay spoiled in subtle ways too dry to serve, too dull to impress, tasting more of absence than of any ingredient. I swept my gaze along the tables and felt, in one sharp moment, as if the last century were personally reproaching my skill. We had no fresh meat laid in, no new bread rising. The ovens were cold, and the stores, though strangely unspoiled, held nothing that felt alive on the tongue. Yet above, a princess and a prince were stepping into a world that was both theirs and not theirs. And it fell to me to make their first shared meal something more than a plate of apology. "Fetch flour," I ordered, and then stopped myself. The sacks in the pantry looked as they had on the morning of the spell, but the fields that had grown them were now in other hands. The mill that had ground them might be rubble or a story. I could not send a boy down to the village with a note on palace stationery and expect anyone to understand or obey. To them we were the ghosts. So I did something I had not done in years. I went to the gate myself. The briar tunnel that had opened for the prince still gaped, a kind of green throat, lined with thorns bent back as if in reluctant courtesy. I stepped into its shadow with more hesitation than I would ever admit. The air smelled of sap and old sleep. At the far end, daylight flared, and beyond it lay a world that had lived an entire lifetime for every one of our frozen hours. A small crowd had gathered there already, villagers in clothes cut a little differently from the ones I remembered, children craning their necks, old women clutching each other's sleeves. They stared at me with open mouths. To them, I must have looked as much a relic as the statues in the churchyard, an old man in an older livery, stepping out of a hedge that their grandparents had been warned not to touch. One of the elders pushed forward, her back bent, but her eyes sharp as a new knife. "My grandfather's grandfather told us of you," she said. "His father had seen the smoke from your chimneys the day they went out. They said a spell fell, and no one ever came or went again. Children have been daring each other to throw stones at these thorns for as long as anyone can remember. And for you," I replied, "it was all that long. For us, it was an afternoon." She nodded slowly, as if testing that thought on her tongue. We had become a story while we slept. They had buried their dead, married their children, survived winters and celebrated harvests, all with the silent hill of our palace at the edge of their vision, wrapped in thorns and warning. Now we had stepped back into their lives, as if no more than a nap separated us from the day we vanished. "We need flour," I said, "and meat, vegetables, fruit what you can spare. A princess has woken, and there will be a meal to market." The villagers exchanged glances. Once, such a request from the palace would have been a summons, not a plea. Kings did not ask what their subjects could spare. They sent wagons and took. But time had worked on more than the mortar of our walls. The people of the valley had learned to live without royal demands. Their faces told me they were weighing not only what sat in their larders, but what they owed to a line of rulers who had slept through their great-grandparents' years of hunger and rain. At last, the old woman straightened as much as she could. "A sleeping child is still a child," she said. "We will send what we can, not because you are the old king's men, but because she will wake in a world she does not know, and it should greet her with more than an empty table." Within an hour, carts began to arrive. Sacks of flour milled by hands I did not know. Chickens that had never seen the inside of our coops. Baskets of apples from trees planted long after the night of the christening. We carried them through the tunnel, the sharp green smell of the briars mixing with the scents of earth and feathers and fruit. In that strange procession I felt keenly how much of a cook's work is trust. To take what others have grown, raised and ground and turn it into something that feeds bodies and joins lives. Back in the kitchen, my staff had shaken off their bewilderment and fallen into the familiar dance of preparation. Knives flashed, water boiled, dough came together under firm hands. We moved faster than on any day I could recall, yet there was a hush under the activity, a sense that each cut and stir belonged not only to a meal, but to a hinge in the story we had been dragged through. I chose simple dishes, the kind that do not depend on delicacy or fashion. Fresh bread, still warm enough to steam when torn. A clear soup that would welcome whatever herbs the villagers' gardens offered. Roasted fowl, seasoned well, but not heavily, so that the meat itself could speak. A tart of apples and honey whose sweetness might, for an hour, stand between the princess and the realization of all she had lost and gained in the same breath. When at last we carried the platters up, the hall felt both exactly as it had always been and entirely new. The same beams overhead, the same faded tapestries, but faces that did not match the memories stamped into these stones. The courtiers around the king and queen were ours, but the onlookers at the edges villagers, neighbouring lords, men in cuts of cloth I did not recognize, belonged to the world we had skipped. At the high table, The princess sat beside the prince. She was quieter than on her 15th birthday, but there was no fear in her eyes, only an alertness, as if she were reading a book whose language she knew but whose script had changed. The prince leaned toward her when she spoke, listening as if nothing in the hall mattered more than her soft comments about the taste of the bread or the colour of the wine. When she lifted the first piece of bread to her mouth, her gaze met mine across the hall. She smiled a small private acknowledgment that this too was a kind of reunion. She chewed, swallowed, and nodded once, as if confirming that the world, whatever else it had done in our absence, still knew how to offer plain sustenance. Around them, conversations fluttered. Some spoke of omens and miracles. Others whispered about politics, what it might mean for a prince from away to marry a girl whose kingdom had slept through a century. For all their words, I knew none of them could really measure the distance they were crossing. Numbers 100, 16, one's it easily on the tongue. It is living them that tests us. That night, when the hall had emptied and the last pot was scrubbed, I sat on a stool and let my hands rest in my lap. My body ached with the familiar fatigue of a feast day, but beneath it lay a stranger weariness, as though my bones had finally caught up with the years they had missed. The world outside had aged in long, slow steps. We had leapt in a single bound. The princess and her prince had found each other where those two paths met. The rest of us would need time to decide whether we felt more like survivors, intruders, or guests at our own table. In our quieter lives, too, there are seasons when we wake up to find that time has been moving faster in some parts of us than in others. We realize a friendship has grown distant while we were busy. A child has become almost grown while we were looking elsewhere. A habit has hardened into something like fate. We can tell ourselves it has been only a moment, that nothing essential has changed. But we still have to wonder whether honesty does not require us, like that young prince and the villagers who faced our newly opened gate, to admit that the years have been at work and to step forward with a humility that matches the strangeness of the hour. The wedding followed more quickly than anyone would have expected, though perhaps that is always the way when time has just played such a bold trick on you. The king did not speak of long engagements or careful negotiations. He had nearly lost his daughter to a spindle and a century. Now he had her back, alive and smiling, with a prince who had walked through thorns to reach her. Caution, for once, deferred to gratitude. From my corner, arranging trays for the smaller feasts that bloomed around the great one, I watched the two of them together. The princess moved with the same quiet grace she had always had, but there was a new steadiness in her gaze, as if the long sleep had laid a thin layer of calm over her. The prince stayed near without clinging, listening more than he spoke. When she whispered a question, he bent close without making a show of it, as if they were already used to sharing the world between them. The formal wedding was held not in the great hall, but in the chapel that clung to the side of the palace like a folded hand. Stone cool, candles steady, air smelling of wax and old wood. I helped prepare the modest meal that would follow, a contrast to the grander feasts outside. Bread, wine, a roast or two, fruits, nothing that would make the moment about the table rather than the promise. Some occasions ask for rich distraction. Others need only enough food to keep the vows from being spoken on an empty stomach. The priest's words echoed up into the rafters, then down again into the pockets of silence between phrases. I could not hear every sentence from the anteroom where I stood with a tray, but certain words carried even through the door. Honor, keep, forsake, death. Old words, older than any fairy's curse, and yet we keep using them, as if each fresh pair of lips might find a way to mean them more faithfully than those before. When they stepped out into the courtyard as husband and wife, the bells rang again. Less astonished this time, more like old friends who had remembered how. Villagers craned their necks to see, some standing on walls, others on overturned buckets. For them, this was a story that had jumped from legend into daylight. The sleeping princess of their grandparents' tales now walked beside a living man, her hand on his arm, her veil lifting in the breeze. To us, who had known her laughter and her appetite and the way she wrinkled her nose at too much nutmeg, it was simply our girl taking a step none of us could take for her. In the days that followed, talk turned to travel. The prince's father, the king of his own land, was growing old. His mother, people said, came from a family known more for sharp teeth than soft words. It was whispered in kitchens like mine, where truth and rumour simmer together, that her people had an ancient taste for dishes no ordinary table would serve, and that the court had always been careful about what reached her plate. When the message finally came that the old king had died, there was no more delaying. The prince had to return to his kingdom and take up the crown. The princess would go with him, of course. A queen does not remain in a palace wrapped in thorns when her husband's people need to see her face and weigh their hopes against it. And because a queen must eat, and because she trusted the hands that had fed her since she could first hold a spoon, I was asked whether I would make the journey too. Leaving the kitchen where I had spent most of my life was a stranger wrench than waking after 100 years. The hearth where I had burned my first pot and perfected my best sauces. The hooks that knew the weight of my favourite pans. The door frame where the young princess had first stood, nose full of soup and curiosity. All these would be someone else's concern now. Yet there is a time when even a cook must admit that recipes are not the only things that can be repeated. Staying would have meant learning to feed a court whose children and worries belong to another story. Going meant following the line of this tale wherever it bent next, whether into honour or trouble. So I packed my knives, my notebooks, and the wooden spoon worn smooth by years of stirring other people's hunger, and I joined the small company that rode out with the prince and princess toward their new life. The road was unfamiliar in every direction. We passed villages that had only ever known our palace as a bristling hill of thorns in the distance. Farmers wiped their hands on their trousers and stared as we went by, making the sign against evil or blessing us, depending on which version of the story they had been told as children. In some places they cheered. In others they simply watched, wary, as if unsure whether waking ghosts could be trusted with crowns again. At night we camped under skies that had continued to turn while we slept. The stars were in their old places, but the constellations had gathered new names in the mouths of the younger men who sat around the fire. They pointed out patterns I did not recognize, told stories I had never heard. I listened, understanding perhaps half of the words, and realized that within the same sky different generations can live under different maps. The princess moved easily among them, asking the lads about their homes, laughing at their tales of mischief. She had always been quick to learn, and 100-year leap had not dulled that. Still, in quiet moments, when she thought no one saw, her eyes went distant, turned back toward the bramble-covered hill that held the rooms of her childhood. Even the bravest traveller carries, in some pocket of the heart, a small ache for familiar thresholds and the sound of a door they know. As for the prince, he rode with the kind of straightness that comes from knowing people are watching. Yet, when he and I ended up by the same fire one evening, sharing bread that had baked at the edge of the coals, he confessed he did not know exactly how his mother would receive them. "My father will bless this marriage," he said. "He has always loved my tales of strange roads. My mother loves power and control. I have brought her neither a treaty nor a field of new taxes, but a girl from a story. I do not know what appetite that will stir." There it was again, that word appetite, straddling the line between the tongue and the heart. A cook pays attention when people speak of hunger in tones more suited to fear than to desire. I found myself thinking not only of the dishes I would serve in that new palace, but of the unseen hungers that might sit down with us at the table. We crossed the border at dawn on a day when mist lay low over the fields. The prince's kingdom unrolled before us. Different crops, different cuts of stone in the houses, a different tilt to the church spires. No briars here, no thorns wrapping the royal hill. The castle rose clean and sharp against the sky, its flags still at half-mast for the dead king. As we approached, horns sounded on the walls. Gates swung open. A new story readied itself to swallow the end of the old. Standing once more in an unfamiliar kitchen, touching stones that did not yet know my steps, I felt at once very old and very new. I was still the man who had watched a child taste soup for the first time, who had slept through a century and woken to find bread waiting to be made. But I was also a stranger now, in a place where the princess's safety would depend not on forgotten spindles, but on the temper of a mother-in-law whose hunger was said to run in darker channels than ordinary greed. In our own lives there are seasons when we leave the kitchens and corridors we know, following someone or something we love into rooms where the air smells different and the rules have not yet been spoken aloud. We can tell ourselves that a new place is only a change of walls, that our old skills will be enough. Yet we still have to wonder whether we are ready not just for different recipes, but for different hungers both in others and in ourselves that may reveal themselves only once the first meal has been set on the table. The first morning in the new palace, I woke before the rest of the household. Old habits travel faster than baggage. The kitchens here lay lower than ours had, partly sunk into the earth, their ceilings braced with heavy beams darkened by smoke from generations of fires I had not tended. The stone was different under my feet, narrower slabs, more cracks, as if this building clenched its jaw a little harder than the one wrapped in roses we had left behind. The staff watched me with guarded eyes. To them, I was an intruder from a story, the cook who had slept with an entire court and woken without a wrinkle of time in his mind. They knew knives and ovens. I knew none of their familiar tricks and shortcuts. Respect in a kitchen is not granted by title, but by what you can put on a plate. So I did the only thing I could. I rolled up my sleeves, asked questions, and listened. Their tools were good, their ingredients, when the markets were kind, better than good. Their flavours tended toward the strong and the rich. Heavy creams, dark sauces, seasonings that clung to the tongue long after the dish was finished. It was cooking designed to impress, to overwhelm. I asked as casually as I could which recipes were the Queen Mother's favourites. A hush answered me, the brief silence of people testing how far they dare speak. "She prefers meat," someone said at last. The way he said the word told me that the subject was not closed, only carefully folded. I met her that evening when we laid the first formal supper for the new-come king and queen. The great hall of this castle was narrower than ours, its columns taller, making the room feel like a forest of stone trunks. At the high table, the prince now king sat on his father's carved chair, the princess at his side. On his other side, like a shadow that refused to move with the light, sat his mother. She was not old in the way the forgotten fairy had been. Her hair, still largely dark, was arranged with ruthless precision. Her garments were splendid enough, but it was her face that drew the eye. Beautiful, some would have said, and they would not have been wrong. But there was a hardness in the line of her mouth, a glitter at the back of her gaze that reminded me more of a predator than a parent. When she smiled, it was as if her teeth had something to prove. I watched her eat. A cook always does, especially when the person in question can decide whether you keep your position. She tasted everything, but her attention sharpened when the meat arrived, roasts, stews, a particular dish of braised cuts in wine that seemed an old favourite. She ate with delicate manners and an absent air, as if the food were a routine comfort, not a delight. Yet every so often she glanced at her son and his new bride with a hunger that had nothing to do with the platters before her. Rumours about her bloodline had reached us even in our bramble-wrapped hill. People whispered that somewhere in her family tree human branches tangled with something older and fiercer, that her people were known for appetites that did not end at ordinary flesh. I had always filed such talk under the heading Cook's Reserve for impossible dishes. Interesting, best left theoretical. Now, watching the way her eyes followed the princess's hands as she reached for a piece of fruit, I found those old stories pressing up against the edge of my mind. Time, this time, did not leap. It moved in its proper, patient way. Seasons turned. The king took up the business of ruling, guided at first by his council and watched keenly by his mother. The young queen walked among the people, visiting markets and churches, listening to petitions with the same attentive tilt of the head she had once given to pots in our kitchen. The court, which had looked at her first as a curiosity from a legend, began to look at her as something simpler and more demanding, a sovereign they needed to understand. Then, as happens in all kingdoms where love is given at least a little room to breathe, there came the news that she was with child. Pregnancy sits oddly on a woman who has already escaped one fate. The queen moved more slowly, leaning on the arm of her women when stairs rose too steeply. She tired sooner, yet there was a lightness in her that reminded me of her girlhood visits to the old kitchen, when she had reached for a spoon and laughed at the way steam made her hair curl. In the palace corridors, people began to speak the names of possible heirs in cautious, hopeful tones. In the kitchens, we planned broths and gentle dishes for the months ahead. The Queen Mother's face, when she heard the news, did not open so quickly. She smiled, of course, and offered the proper words. But behind the courteous phrases I saw calculation. A grandchild meant continuity, which could be pleasing. It also meant that the new queen would be more firmly rooted in this kingdom than any visiting bride could be. For a woman who had long been the centre of power at court, the prospect of her reign thinning into a mere memory could not have been easy to swallow. When the baby came a girl, with eyes that took in the world as soberly as her mother's. The joy in the palace tasted almost simple. The king's shoulders loosened. The queen, pale and exhausted, asked at once for her child before asking for water. The little one slept in her cradle, with one fist clenched around nothing, as if holding tight already to the thread that bound her to this noisy, complicated life. We called her Dawn around the stoves, if not in the official announcements, because that is what she felt like. The first pale promise of a day, not yet fully seen. The Queen Mother visited the nursery often. She brought costly gifts, tiny jewels, embroidered gowns, a silver rattle that chimed too sweetly to my ear. She cooed and praised, but when she looked down at the child, there was a depth in her gaze that made the nurses cross themselves when her back was turned. It is one thing to see a baby as hope, another to see it as possibility of another kind. The questions began in the kitchen soon after. "Tell me," the Queen Mother said one afternoon, her voice as casual as if we were discussing the weather. "Do you know the old dishes of my people? There are specialties you will not find in every cookbook." Her fingers toyed with the edge of a recipe book bound in leather so dark it drank up the light. I answered that I knew many recipes, but every land had its own tastes. Perhaps she would enlighten me. She spoke then of stews so rich they were said to give strength beyond human measure, of sauces that could disguise any flavour, of ways to prepare meat so that no one could tell exactly what they were eating, only that it satisfied something deep and peculiar in them. Her words were smooth, but behind them I heard the echo of older tales the kind mothers tell to frighten children from forests and strangers' houses. I remembered the way the villagers back home had lowered their voices when they spoke of ogres, and I felt the hairs on my arms lift. One of her ladies, braver or more foolish than most, joked lightly that with the new princess in the nursery, there would soon be no need for unusual dishes. The Queen Mother's smile thinned. Her eyes flicked to mine, measuring. "A cook," she said, "must be ready to serve whatever his sovereign desires. You, of all people, should understand that." And I did. I had served feasts to celebrate births, meals to steady hands before battles, quiet suppers to soothe weary minds. Food shapes bodies, but it also reveals the heart. To feed an honest hunger is honourable work. To feed a twisted one is another matter. That afternoon, as I watched the Queen Mother leave the kitchen surrounded by her silent ladies, I understood that the danger in this new palace did not come from curses shouted in front of a crowd, but from appetites that cloaked themselves in silk and called their cravings a right. When, some years later, the Queen bore a second childer-boy this time, bright-eyed and loud we rejoiced again. We called him Day in our talk, because he followed dawn as naturally as morning follows first light. The palace filled with the ordinary chaos of young life, footsteps in the corridors, small voices calling for bread, sudden naps in inconvenient places. The king who had danced once with a girl from a story, now knelt to let a toddler pull at his beard. The queen, who had slept through a century, now woke at odd hours to soothe nightmares that belonged to nothing more magical than an overfed stomach. The Queen Mother held these children on her knee, stroked their hair, fed them little sweets from her own hand. Yet, when she watched them sleep, her gaze hardened into something I recognized from the way some men look at a lamb before spring. In that look, I saw my own future narrowing to a point. Sooner or later, she would ask me to make one of those old dishes for which no honest market sells ingredients. In our own lives, too, there are moments when we realize we are standing at the edge of someone else's dark hunger, whether for praise, for control, for possession, and that they expect us to feed it. We can tell ourselves we are only doing our job, only following orders, only filling plates. But we still have to wonder whether there comes a point at which setting down the dish makes us more responsible than any curse shouted by a stranger at a christening ever could. The king did not go to war at once. For a few years he stayed close to his young family, as if wary of leaving them to the full weather of his mother's moods. But kings are like ships, they are built to be sent out. When unrest stirred on a distant border, when messengers arrived with tight shoulders and maps unfolded like unwelcome tablecloths, he could no longer remain. He kissed his wife, lifted each child in turn, and promised to return before the peaches ripened twice. The day he rode away, the air in the palace cooled by a degree no hearth could correct. The queen stood at a window, with dawn and day pressed against her skirts, watching the line of horses shrink along the road. Behind them, the Queen Mother stood a little way back, expression unreadable. When the last flash of steel vanished over the hill, she stepped forward and laid a hand on her daughter-in-law's shoulder with carefully measured warmth. "You are not alone," she said. "I will see that everything continues as it should." For a time, she kept to that promise, at least in appearances. Business went on. Petitions were heard. The children played in the courtyards, their laughter echoing off stone that had known quieter days. The young queen managed affairs with a seriousness that did not drown her gentleness. The Queen Mother watched, intervening only when she could wear her corrections like jewels. Then, one evening, she summoned me. Her private chamber lay high in the east tower, a room that smelled of polished wood, strong perfume, and something else I could not immediately name, a faint metallic note, like a knife, just sharpened. She sat by the window when I entered, hands folded, face composed. For a moment she spoke of ordinary things, the quality of the bread, the wine chosen for supper, the way the kitchen garden had improved under my care. Her words were smooth, but her eyes had the stillness of someone watching a particular thought ripen. At last she turned the conversation with the ease of a knife slipping between joints. "You are an honest man," she said, "loyal to my son, loyal to his little family. I have noticed." I bowed, uncertain whether this was praise or accusation. "Such loyalty is admirable," she went on. "It will be tested now. War is a hungry thing. The people are restless. Symbols must sometimes be rearranged to keep order. Tomorrow, at supper, I wish to be served a very particular dish." Her voice softened. "You remember the specialties I mentioned? The old recipes. It is time we made use of them." My mouth dried. My hands which could lift heavy pots without strain, suddenly felt too large. "My lady," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady, "the markets carry no such meats as those you hinted at. We have lamb, kid, fowl, beef, but nothing." She cut me off with a slight movement of her hand. "You misunderstand," she said. "I am not asking you to buy. I am telling you to prepare. Tomorrow you will take the little princess," she used Dawn's given name, "but I will not write it here. You will remove her and serve me a dish that no one at table will recognize for what it is. You have your sources, your cleverness. I trust you to make it unmistakable only to me. There are moments when the world seems to contract to the size of a knife edge." I felt the stone under my feet, the weight of years of service pressing at my back, the knowledge that a word of refusal could snap my life like a twig. I also saw, as clearly as if she stood between us, the image of a small girl in the nursery, hair rumpled from sleep, hands reaching for a crust of bread with perfect trust. "My lady," I began, and found that my throat would not close properly around the lie she expected. She leaned forward, eyes brightening in a way that made me think of fire catching. "Do not force me to repeat myself," she said softly. "You know the penalties for disobedience, not only for you, for your helpers, your family. The stories of my people are not only stories. I suggest you remember that. Now go. I expect you to bring me her tomorrow evening, well disguised under your skill." I left that tower with my heart pounding as if I had run miles. The corridors blurred, lanterns smeared into streaks of light. In the kitchen, my staff turned to me for the usual instructions. How much to roast, what to set aside, which herbs to cut, and I heard myself answer as if from underwater. That night I did not sleep. I sat alone on a stool long after the fires had died, listening to the settling of the building, the quiet breathing of those who trusted their dreams, to a world I knew had turned more dangerous by a single conversation. We tell ourselves that we will know what to do when we are asked to cross a line we swore we never would. But the line, when it arrives, is often wrapped in silk and spoken in a voice that has fed us praise before it feeds us threats. At dawn, I made my decision. I went first not to the market, not to the Queen Mother's tower, but to the nursery. Dawn sat on the floor among her toys, hair uncombed, cheeks still soft with sleep. When she saw me, she smiled with the uncomplicated delight children reserve for those who have never failed to bring them food. "You look tired," she said. "Have you been up all night baking?" Something like a laugh escaped me, ragged at the edges. I told her that I needed her help with a game, a secret one. We were going to pretend, I said, that she was a kitten hiding from a fox, and that my little room off the kitchen was the safest cupboard in the world. Her eyes widened at the thought of danger turned into play. She agreed at once. I wrapped her in an old cloak, more to muffle her bright gown than to keep her warm, and spirited her through the back passages down to my quarters, a narrow space with a low bed, a small chest, and a window that looked onto the courtyard where the kitchen herbs grew. My wife, who had followed me through many kitchens and slept through the same 100-year enchantment, met my eyes, read the whole situation in a breath, and said only, "We will keep her quiet. Children are not good at staying hidden." Before the morning was half gone, Dawn had asked a dozen questions, tried to peek through the keyhole, and declared that secret cupboards were only fun if they came with biscuits. My wife produced bread and cheese and turned the hiding into a picnic. I slipped back to the nursery, told the nurses the princess was with her grandmother, and returned to the kitchen with my plan solidifying like cooled sugar. For supper, I chose the finest young lamb in our stores. I seasoned it carefully, slow-cooked it until the meat was tender enough to fall apart at the touch of a spoon, and cloaked it in a sauce so rich and dark that even the keenest tongue would have been hard-pressed to name its source. As I worked, my hands moved with the precision of long practice, but my mind ran ahead to the high table, to the Queen Mother's eyes watching my every gesture. When the dish was ready, I carried it up myself. The hall smelled of roasted meat and expectation. The king's place sat empty. We had arranged the table to emphasize the Queen Mother's central seat. The young queen, pale from a day of wondering where her daughter was, sat with her hands clenched beneath the linen. I set the dish before the older woman. She looked up at me, a question unspoken in the curve of her mouth. "This is the special dish you requested, my lady," I said, prepared with all my skill. She took the first bite, chewed slowly, swallowed. Her eyes closed briefly, and when they opened, there was a strange satisfaction in them, dark and deep. "Excellent," she said. "You may tell the staff that the task is complete." Relief and revulsion washed over me in equal measure. I bowed and withdrew, legs unsteady. In the safety of the kitchen, my wife met me with a look that needed no words. Dawn, crumb-streaked and indignant at being kept from the evening's bustle, asked when the game would be over. Soon I lied, very soon. Days passed. The Queen's grief was quiet, held in the hollow under her eyes. The Queen Mother watched her with an air of indulgent patience, as if sorrow were a childish illness that would pass. Then, as inevitably as the turning of the spit over the fire, she summoned me again. "The boy, this time," she said, almost lazily. "Day, you did well before. Do not fail me now. I will not linger on the pattern that followed." Once more, a cloak and a hurried flight through back corridors. Once more, a hiding place, this time a disused storeroom off the scullery, filled with sacks of grain and the muffled giggles of siblings turned conspirators. Once more, a dish prepared from honest meat, disguised in a sauce thick enough to bear the weight of a monstrous assumption. Once more, the Queen Mother's satisfied silence after the first bite, and the quiet despair of a mother who did not know that two of her children now played at pirates among flour barrels while her heart broke upstairs. It is tempting, looking back, to praise myself for courage, to imagine that my refusal saved more than it risked. But I remember also how I bowed, how I played along with the Queen Mother's illusion, how I let her believe she had satisfied an appetite that should never have been named. I protected the innocent, yes, but I also fed a lie. The third summons came one afternoon when the sun slanted low through the kitchen windows, turning the chopping boards to gold. The Queen Mother's messenger bowed and delivered the words exactly, his voice as flat as a platter. "Her Majesty requests a special dish for tomorrow," he said. The Queen herself. I stood very still, knife in hand, breath caught between ribs. Dawn and day had squeezed themselves into my life as easily as into my cramped quarters, filling our days with questions and spilled milk, and the sound of small feet on stone. To hide them had been dangerous. To hide their mother would be something else entirely. It would mean stepping from quiet defiance into open rebellion. That night, sitting by the darkened hearth, I counted out my choices like ingredients on the table. Obey, and become the hand that carried a young woman I had watched grow from a child into a queen, to her ruin. Refuse and risk not only my life, but those of my wife, my hidden charges, everyone who had ever taken my bread. Reveal the truth and turn the Queen Mother's hunger into open fury. We like to imagine that morality is a straight recipe. Add courage, subtract fear, stir. In practice, it is more like a stew made from whatever we have on hand: memories, loyalties, fears, sudden flashes of clarity. As the embers cooled, I still did not know exactly which path I would take the next day. I only knew that the line I had been skirting no longer lay ahead of me. I was already standing on it, knife in hand, heart pounding like a fist on a locked door. Morning came, whether I was ready for it or not. The summons from the Queen Mother arrived with the first light, as punctual as guilt. Her messenger bowed, lips tight, and repeated the order I already knew by heart. The special dish, prepared that evening, from meat she would not name, but I understood too well. This time she did not even bother to send for me in person. Power grows careless when it believes its appetite has already been obeyed. I did not go to her tower. I went to the Queen. She sat in a small solar near the nursery, a piece of mending forgotten in her hands, eyes turned toward a world only she could see. Grief had carved fine lines at the corners of her mouth, yet something in her posture refused to bend. When I came in, she looked up with polite weariness, the way one does when another condolence is on its way. "Your Majesty," I said, and my voice came out rough. "I have deceived you." That made her sit straighter. I told her, as quickly and quietly as I could, the truth I had been carrying like a hot coal, that her children were alive, hidden in storerooms and cupboards, fed on stolen bread and the patience of my wife, that the dishes the Queen Mother had eaten with such satisfaction had been lamb and kid, dear and clever seasoning, never the flesh she believed she had demanded, that now the same demand was turning toward her. As I spoke, her face changed in small, precise ways. Shock first, like a door flung open, then disbelief, then fragile, fierce hope at the mention of her children's names, then a fear so deep it stilled even her hands. "You risked everything," she whispered. "Why?" "Because I am a cook," I wanted to say, "and cooks know the difference between hunger and cruelty." Instead, I told her the plainer truth. "Because I have watched you grow from a girl into a queen, and I could not bring myself to season the plate that ended your line." For a long moment we sat in a silence held up by the thin beams of trust. If she chose to expose my lies, my life would not outlast the next hour. If I chose to take back my confession, her children would be dragged from their hiding places by someone less scrupulous than I. In that fragile space, she made her choice. "Take me to them," she said. I led her by the back stairs, through the humbler arteries of the palace. In the little room off the kitchen, Dawn sprang to her feet with a cry that broke every rule of secrecy, flinging herself into her mother's arms. In the grain storeroom, Day shouted with laughter at the sight of her, then burst into hiccuping tears when he saw her expression. The Queen gathered them both in, holding them with a kind of desperate gentleness, as if the world might at any moment remember its intention to steal them. When she could finally speak, she lifted her head. "What will you do now?" she asked me. She meant, "What shall we do?" I told her my plan, such as it was. We would move them, all queen and children, into the old hunting lodge at the far edge of the palace grounds, a place half forgotten since the old king's legs had stiffened. The kitchens there were small but workable. The approach could be watched from the kitchen garden window. My wife and I would see to their food. The Queen would stay hidden until either her husband returned or the Queen Mother's hunger turned elsewhere. "You will tell her I am dead," she said, her voice strangely calm. "I will tell her," I answered, "that I have obeyed." We moved quickly. By twilight, the lodge held 3 secret lives and the clatter of makeshift pots. I returned to the main kitchen and set about preparing another deception. This time I chose a hind from the royal forests, its flesh lean and delicate. I marinated it in wine until the scent of the meat blurred into something richer, then braised it slowly with herbs that would confuse even a careful tongue. By the time the dish was ready, I could hardly bear the smell of it myself. At supper, the Queen's place sat empty. The Queen Mother remarked upon it with a show of concern. "Is my daughter-in-law unwell?" she asked, every syllable polished. I bowed and delivered the careful lie I had rehearsed. "Her Majesty," I said, "found the strain of grief too much. She has withdrawn. She asked that I present this dish to you as a sign of her obedience in all things." The Queen Mother's eyes gleamed. She took the first bite with visible pleasure, rolling the flavour on her tongue as if savouring more than taste. "Excellent," she murmured. "You are a man who understands what is required." For a while the arrangement held. Days slipped into a strained pattern. In the main palace, life went on with its usual faces all, to the Queen Mother's mind, accounted for. In the lodge at the fringes, I cooked simpler meals and listened to children argue over chess pieces carved from old bread. The Queen learned to keep the fire low and her voice lower. At night, when I trudged back to my own bed, I felt like a man walking a knife laid flat. One careless step, and everything I had balanced would spill. The slip, when it came, was small, as such slips usually are. A kitchen boy, sent to gather herbs from the garden by the old lodge, returned with more than thyme and parsley. Wide-eyed, he told a friend he had heard a child laughing behind the shutter and seen a woman's shadow pass the window. The friend told another. By the time the whisper reached the wrong ears, the story had grown teeth and a tail. The Queen Mother summoned me once more. This time there was no polite conversation first. Her chamber felt colder, the air tighter. "You have been very busy," she said. Her voice had lost its silk. "There are rumours of ghosts at the hunting lodge. Small ghosts. A woman's shade." I kept my face blank. "Old houses creak," I said. "Wind in the shutters can sound like anything." Her hand tightened on the arm of her chair until the knuckles shone. "I have eaten," she said slowly, "the dishes you brought me. I have trusted that the blood of my line was being honoured properly. If I discover that you have made a fool of me, cook, there will not be bone or scrap of you left unpunished." She dismissed me with a flick of her fingers. but her eyes told me she would not be satisfied with rumours for long. That evening, as I carried a basket of bread toward the lodge, I saw movement at the edge of the trees, a flash of dark fabric, the glint of a ring in fading light. Someone was watching the path. I turned back, heart pounding. It was no longer safe to visit them openly. The Queen Mother moved faster than I expected. By the following noon, workmen were hauling a great cauldron into the courtyard, a vat so wide 3 men could have lain end to end inside it. They set it over a fire pit dug hastily in the paving. Barrels were rolled up and emptied into it. Water, bundles of writhing things I chose not to look at too closely, sacks that hissed when they hit the surface. "What is this for?" one of my assistants whispered. "Punishment," another answered, quietly. The Queen Mother stood at a balcony above, directing the preparations with the cool attention she might have given a banquet. When she caught my eye, she smiled. "We must be ready," she called down, "for the return of my son. He will want to know that those who have betrayed his house have been dealt with properly." I knew then that she had decided on her course. Whether she had proof of my deception or only suspicion, she meant to make an example of someone of all of us, perhaps. The Queen, the children, the cook who had dared to season her hunger with defiance. We like to tell ourselves that evil announces itself with fanfare, with snarls and open threats. More often it looks like a carefully arranged scene, a vat bubbling in a courtyard, a woman in fine clothes explaining that everything is for the good of the realm. Standing there, the heat from the cauldron on my face and the weight of my own choices on my shoulders, I could not see a single path that did not end in that boiling pit. Then, from beyond the walls, faint at first but growing clearer, came the sound of trumpets. Not the bright, curious notes of a stranger's arrival, but an old, familiar fanfare, the pattern every servant recognizes in his bones, the king returning to his own gate. The men at the cauldron glanced up. The Queen Mother's hand froze in mid-gesture. In the lodge at the edge of the grounds, a queen and 2 children must have heard it too, and felt hope and fear collide inside them like pots on a shelf in an earthquake. Sometimes at the last possible moment, another hand lifts the pot from the fire. Sometimes it does not. As the trumpets rang out again, closer now, I did not know which it would be. I only knew that the story, which had carried us through sleep and thorns and hunger, was about to show us what lay at its core, when the masks dropped and the table was truly turned. Trumpets have a way of making even stone stand to attention. The fanfare rolled across the courtyard, bouncing off towers, slipping through windows, threading its way down stairwells and into the very corners where servants pretend not to listen. Men stepped back from the cauldron without meaning to. A ladle clanged softly against the rim. The Queen Mother's hand, still raised in command, finished its gesture as if nothing had changed, but the line of her shoulders had tightened. The gates opened. The king rode in at the head of his escort, armor dusty, face thinner, eyes older than when he had left. War had left its fingerprints on him, but it had not broken him. When he saw the great pot smoking in the middle of his own courtyard, his horse shied, and he had to steady it with a word and a touch. He looked from the cauldron to his mother on the balcony, then to me among the kitchen staff below. "What is this?" he called out. The Queen Mother answered before I could. "A necessary measure," she said, her voice smooth as ever. In your absence, your wife and children betrayed you. They conspired against your throne. I have dealt with them as our law demands." She let the words hang in the air like steam. Her gaze flicked to me, a warning sharpened to a point. For a heartbeat, the courtyard held its breath. Soldiers shifted on their feet. Servants pressed themselves against walls. The king's face went very still, the way it had gone, I imagined, when he had watched a friend fall in battle. He dismounted slowly, handed his reins to a squire, and stepped closer to the cauldron, as if expecting to see proof of what she claimed rise from its depths. He saw only boiling broth and shapes that might have been anything at all. "Where is my wife?" he asked. His voice was quiet, and that quiet frightened me more than any shout. The Queen Mother began a careful speech about duty and hard choices, about bloodlines and loyalty, about the burden she had borne while he was away. Words, like rich sauces, can be reduced until their essence is almost too strong to taste clearly. I saw him listening, but I also saw something else, a flicker in his eyes when she spoke of the Queen as if she were an object, a pawn cleared from a board. There are moments when a story waits, like a pot on low heat, for someone to decide whether to let it boil over or to lift it away. I felt that moment pressing at my back. My hands shook. My legs wanted to carry me anywhere but forward. And then I thought of a spindle, a forgotten tower. A child fed on my soup. A girl who had thanked me for honest food and once asked me if blessings only make larger what we practice every day. I stepped out from the cluster of servants. "Your Majesty," I said, and my voice sounded small in the open air. "I ask leave to speak." The Queen Mother's head snapped toward me. The look in her eyes said clearly enough what she thought of cooks who talked at moments like this. The king, however, gestured for me to go on. So I told him, not everything. I did not have time for the whole long road we had walked together, but enough. That his children lived, hidden, that his wife was with them, that the dishes his mother had praised had been made from animals that had never walked the nurseries, that the cauldron before him had been prepared not as justice, but as the next step in a hunger that had forgotten any limit but itself. There is a kind of silence that falls when people hear a truth they did not know they were starving for. It dropped into the courtyard then. The king's face changed, not quickly, but steadily, as if the lines of it were being redrawn from inside. He looked up at his mother on the balcony, at the great pot, at me. "Is this true?" he asked her. "Not thunder, just iron." She laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "You will take the word of a cook over your own mother," she said. "Over the woman who bore you, who guided you, who kept your throne from being gnawed away while you were off playing at war." She reached for more words about loyalty, about ingratitude, about what rulers must be willing to do it, but something in the watching faces below stopped her tongue. Too many eyes had heard too much. Servants may be invisible in comfort, but in crisis they are witnesses, and witnesses give a story. Wait. The king did not move at first. Then, very quietly, he gave an order not to me, but to his guards. "Find the queen. Find the children. Bring them here." They ran. I could have told them where to go, but the path was already known. A kitchen boy had loose lips, but he had also left a trail. Within what felt like only a few heartbeats, there they were. The young queen, cheeks pale, but chin lifted. Dawn, clutching a crust of bread like a talisman. Day, eyes wide, hair sticking up from sleep and dust. They stepped into the courtyard, blinking in the sudden light, trying to understand why so many people were staring. The Queen Mother's face, when she saw them, changed in a way I will not forget. Surprise first, genuine this time, then rage stripped of all its silk. Her mouth twisted, and for a moment the rumours about her bloodline seemed less like stories and more like mirrors. She moved toward the balcony rail, fingers curling as if for a shove that might yet send someone toward the boiling pit below. The king stepped between her and the edge. "Enough," he said. This time there was no softness in it at all. "I have ridden through villages where children cry from hunger and men bleed for causes they barely understand. I have seen cruelty dressed as necessity and never thought to see it in my own house. You have asked me to eat my own blood in the name of strength. You have lied to me, to my people, to yourself. There will be no more of it. What followed, I will draw a curtain over. The law of that land was not gentle with those who plotted against the royal line, and the Queen Mother met an end shaped, ironically, by the very instrument she had prepared for others. I will say only that the cauldron did not boil for the ones she had chosen. It boiled for the hunger that had forgotten what it was for, and the court turned its face away, not from cruelty denied, but from justice that had arrived too late to be entirely clean. When it was over, the king ordered the cauldron removed and the stones of that part of the courtyard scrubbed until no trace of soot remained. He took his wife's hand in full sight of everyone and knelt to embrace his children. Then he did something I did not expect. He turned to me. "You have saved my house twice," he said. "Once by feeding it honestly. Once by refusing to feed its worst instincts. I cannot command your conscience, but I can thank it." I bowed, awkward and red-faced, more shaken by gratitude than I had been by threat. "I am only a cook," I began, and he shook his head. "No," he said, "you are a man who knows that what we choose to serve matters." Life after that did not turn into a song. Palaces never do, not for long. There were still arguments in council, lean years in the fields, squabbles in the nursery. Dawn and day grew, first into lanky adolescents who ate more than I thought possible, then into young people with ideas about how the world should be. The Queen learned to rule in a land where her story was no longer only a tale told by firelight, but a memory shared by living mouths. As for me, I grew older in the way cooks do, more scars on my hands, more patience for slow stews, less patience for foolishness dressed up as tradition. I taught younger men and women how to salt properly, how to respect a good onion, how to understand that a kitchen is a kind of truth-telling. You cannot hide the quality of your ingredients forever. A bad cut will reveal itself. Over-seasoning will show its fear. A dishonest dish may please for a moment, but something in the body knows it has been tricked. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, the princess who became queen would slip in, gown hitched up away from the floor, hands bare of jewellery, to taste a spoonful from whatever pot was nearest. We would talk, not of spells or court intrigue, but of small things. A new herb in the garden, a story one of the children had brought from their tutors, the way the light fell in the chapel at dawn. We did not often name the old dangers. We did not have to. They sat with us in the comfortable silences, like shadows that had been invited to take a chair rather than haunt the corners. When I became too stiff to move swiftly between stove and table, they gave me a stool by the warmest hearth and let me complain about over-browned crusts. Dawn would come to ask for recipes. Day would steal extra slices of roast and grin when I pretended not to see. The king would stand in the doorway sometimes, listening, as if the rhythm of kitchen talk steadied whatever storms were brewing beyond our walls. And I, who had once thought my life would be nothing more than a long line of meals fading into one another, found myself at the end of a story in which spindles and thorns and cauldrons all had their say. Yet what I remember most clearly are not the curses or the escapes, but the smaller choices that held the tale together. A plate left empty for a forgotten guest. A girl stepping into a kitchen to taste soup. A man deciding that his loyalty to a family meant telling them a truth that might cost him everything. We like to imagine that turning points arrive with trumpets and banners, but more often they come like a hand reaching for a spoon, a question asked in a quiet room, a decision made over a chopping board when no one is watching. The old fairy at the christening changed the course of a life with a single hard word. The young fairy softened it with another. The queen mother tried to bend fate with hunger. In the end, it was love, and the stubborn insistence on feeding it honestly that kept this house from devouring itself. So now, as an old man with flour still in the cracks of his skin, I sit and sift through these memories like someone sorting grain from chaff. I offer them to you as they rise. The smell of broth on the day a princess was born, the sound of a staff on stone, the sight of a palace asleep under roses, the taste of simple bread shared after a century lost. If there is any lesson in it, perhaps it is only this, that the stories we inherit do not excuse the choices we make, and the appetites we feed become in time the kind of kingdom we live in. And if, when you next lift a spoon, you pause for a heartbeat to ask what and whom you are truly nourishing, then my long watch in the kitchens of this tale will not have been in vain.